In the spring of 1835, on the Ashford plantation outside Charleston, South Carolina, two sisters stood at opposite windows of the same house, each concealing the same impossible secret. Within months, their shared transgression would unravel everything their family had built over 3 generations, and the man they both claimed would become the most dangerous person in the entire state. The Ashford sisters, Catherine and Margaret, were the last remnants of what had once been Carolina's most distinguished planting family. Their father, Colonel Thomas Ashford, had died 18 months earlier, leaving behind not the fortune everyone assumed, but a catastrophic void. The plantation's books, when finally examined, revealed debts totaling $47,000, an amount so staggering that disclosure would mean immediate seizure of the property, the sale of all 63 enslaved people, and the social annihilation of the Ashford name. Catherine, at 28, had assumed management of the estate. She was tall, severe in manner, with the kind of rigid composure that Southern society demanded of unmarried women managing property. Margaret, 3 years younger, possessed the softer features and gentler disposition that had made her the favorite in Charleston drawing rooms before their father's death forced them into seclusion. Neither had married. Neither, it seemed, would marry now. Bankruptcy would see to that. The situation was desperate beyond measure. Creditors were circling. The Charleston Bank had sent 3 letters demanding payment. Judge Thaddeus Whitmore, their largest creditor and a man whose political ambitions had made him ruthless, had begun making inquiries about the true state of Ashford finances. If Whitmore discovered the extent of their insolvency, he would move for immediate foreclosure. He had his eye on Ashford land, and he had the law entirely on his side. It was Catherine who first discovered that their salvation lived in the quarters behind the main house. His name was Josiah. He was 26 years old, and he possessed a skill so rare, so dangerous, that its very existence was a crime punishable by death under South Carolina statute. Josiah could read and write with the facility of a trained attorney. More than that, he understood commercial law, contract language, and the intricate mechanisms of debt restructuring that the Ashford sisters could not begin to comprehend. His previous owner, a merchant named Caldwell who had died of fever in Savannah, had used Josiah as a private clerk for years, teaching him in secret to manage complex shipping manifests and legal documents. When Caldwell's estate was liquidated, Josiah had been sold south to the Ashfords for $800. No one knew what he could do. No one suspected. Catherine discovered his ability by accident. She had been searching through her father's study at midnight, frantically trying to make sense of a particularly dense promissory note, when she noticed lamplight coming from the small room off the kitchen where Josiah slept. She approached quietly and saw him through the half-open door, reading a book, his lips moving silently as he worked through a passage of what appeared to be Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England. For a full minute, Catherine stood frozen. Under South Carolina law, teaching an enslaved person to read was punishable by 100 lashes and a year's imprisonment. For the enslaved person caught reading, the penalty was often death. What she was witnessing was a capital offense. But Catherine Ashford was drowning, and Josiah was the only rope within reach. She entered the room. Josiah looked up, and in his eyes Catherine saw not fear, but calculation. He knew he had been discovered. He knew the power she held. And yet he waited, utterly still, to see what she would choose. Catherine's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely a whisper. She asked him if he understood debt instruments. Josiah said he did. She asked if he could examine her father's papers and tell her if there was any way, any mechanism under law, to delay or restructure what they owed. Josiah said he would need to see everything. Every contract, every note, every piece of correspondence. What happened next would define everything that followed. Catherine agreed. Over the course of 6 weeks, working only at night, Josiah conducted a complete audit of Ashford finances. What he discovered was worse than Catherine had imagined. The debts were real and immediately enforceable. But Josiah found something else. He found that Judge Whitmore's largest note against the Ashfords contained a technical error in the witnessing clause, a flaw that might render it legally unenforceable if challenged in court. It was a slim chance, but it was a chance. The problem was that Catherine could not challenge it herself. As a woman, her testimony in commercial court carried almost no weight. She would need an attorney, and attorneys required payment she did not have. More critically, she could not reveal how she had discovered the flaw without exposing Josiah's literacy and destroying them both. Josiah proposed an alternative. He would forge a letter, ostensibly from a fictional attorney in Savannah, pointing out the defect to Whitmore and suggesting that pressing the note might expose the judge to counter-litigation for fraudulent documentation. It was a bluff built on a technicality, but Whitmore was ambitious and paranoid. The threat of public scandal, even baseless scandal, might be enough to make him withdraw or renegotiate. Catherine agreed. It was the first crime. It would not be the last. The letter was sent. 3 weeks later, Whitmore's response arrived. He demanded a meeting with Catherine and her attorney. The bluff had worked partially. He was concerned. But now he wanted proof that Catherine had legal counsel. He wanted to see the attorney who had discovered his error. Catherine was trapped. There was no attorney. There was only Josiah. And then Margaret walked into the study one evening and found them together, bent over documents, Josiah's hand in mid-sentence as he drafted another letter in the fictional attorney's hand. Margaret's face went white. She understood immediately what she was seeing. She understood the crime and the necessity of it in equal measure. Catherine expected Margaret to recoil, to panic. Instead, Margaret closed the door behind her and asked what she could do to help. That night, the conspiracy expanded from 2 to 3. Margaret, whose delicate features and soft voice had always made her seem fragile, revealed a capacity for deception that surprised even her sister. She suggested they claim the attorney had returned to Savannah due to yellow fever, but had left detailed instructions with the sisters for ongoing negotiations. She proposed they begin attending Charleston's social functions again, projecting confidence and solvency to quiet rumors. She volunteered to personally visit Whitmore and deliver the next set of documents, using her charm to deflect his suspicion. It worked. Over the next 3 months, Whitmore was slowly maneuvered into a position where dropping his claim seemed less damaging than pursuing it. Josiah's forgeries became more elaborate. He drafted affidavits, created fictional correspondence from imaginary legal firms, and even manufactured a completely false letter from a Georgia bank suggesting the Ashfords had secured new credit. Every document was a masterpiece of technical precision. Every lie was layered within enough legal truth to be plausible. But something else was happening in the house. The late-night meetings between Catherine, Margaret, and Josiah had become charged with something more than shared risk. The crime they were committing together, the terrible necessity of their alliance, had created an intimacy that crossed every boundary their world recognized. Catherine felt it first, the way Josiah's eyes lingered on her when he handed her documents, the way his voice dropped when they were alone. She told herself it was gratitude, or strategy, or the natural intensity of two people engaged in life-or-death subterfuge. She told herself anything except the truth. Margaret felt it differently, but just as strongly. She saw in Josiah a mind that matched her own in quickness and exceeded it in depth. When he explained legal principles to her, she heard not just instruction but respect. He spoke to her as an equal, something no man in Charleston had ever done. And in the dark hours when they worked by candlelight, she began to imagine what freedom might look like. Not just his freedom, but hers. The first physical boundary was crossed on a June night thick with heat and the sound of cicadas. Catherine had come to Josiah's room with an urgent question about a new letter from Whitmore. The conversation had stretched long. The hour was late. And when Josiah had explained the solution, when Catherine had felt the flood of relief that they might survive another week, she had reached out and touched his hand. It was a gesture of gratitude, or that was what she told herself. But her hand remained. And Josiah, who had spent his entire life reading the smallest signals of white emotion for signs of danger, read something else in Catherine's face. He saw what? He saw the same desperate loneliness that consumed him. And he made the choice that would doom them both. He kissed her. What followed was not love, not in any pure sense. It was hunger and desperation and the wild, reckless defiance of two people who had come to understand that they were already damned. If their conspiracy was discovered, Josiah would be executed and Catherine ruined. One more transgression, one more secret, hardly seemed to matter. They began meeting 3, then 4 times a week. Always late at night. Always in the small room off the kitchen. Catherine told herself she would stop, that the risk was too great, that what they were doing was not just illegal but insane. But she did not stop. And Josiah, who knew better than anyone the price he would pay if discovered, did not stop either. Then, in September, Margaret discovered them. She had come looking for Catherine late one night and had seen her sister slipping out the back door of the main house. Margaret followed at a distance and watched through the kitchen window as Catherine entered Josiah's room. She waited. An hour passed. Catherine did not emerge. Margaret understood immediately, and what she felt was not horror or moral outrage. What she felt was jealousy so intense it frightened her. She had been telling herself that what she felt for Josiah was intellectual admiration, the natural respect for a brilliant mind trapped in an impossible situation. But watching Catherine disappear into his room, Margaret understood the lie she had been living. She wanted him. She wanted him with the same intensity Catherine clearly did, and the realization shattered something in her. The confrontation happened the next morning. Margaret waited until Josiah was working in the fields, then walked into Catherine's room and closed the door. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten. She simply stated what she knew and asked Catherine if she understood what would happen to all of them if this continued. Catherine expected moral judgment. Instead, Margaret said something that Catherine would never forget. She said that she understood. She said that she felt the same pull, the same impossible want. And then she said that they had to decide, together, what they were going to do. For 3 days, the sisters barely spoke. The weight of their shared secret had become unbearable. They had saved the plantation through crime and conspiracy, but they were now destroying themselves and Josiah through recklessness that neither could control. It was Margaret who proposed the solution, and it was so audacious that Catherine thought at first she was joking. Margaret suggested they share him. Not openly, not in any way that could be discovered, but in carefully managed turns. Catherine would have 2 nights each week. Margaret would have 2 nights, and they would rotate the schedule to minimize risk of pattern and detection. Catherine was appalled. The suggestion seemed to compound the transgression beyond all reason. But Margaret's logic was coldly practical. They were both already guilty of crimes that would lead to execution or lifelong imprisonment. They were both already dependent on Josiah's skills for survival. And they were both, Margaret said quietly, already in love with him in whatever broken way such love was possible. Catherine refused. For 2 weeks, she refused. But the longing did not abate. And when she looked at her sister, she saw the same hunger eating Margaret alive. Finally, in late September, Catherine agreed. They told Josiah together. He listened in silence as they explained the arrangement. When they finished, he asked only one question. He asked if they truly believed they could keep this secret, given how many boundaries they were now crossing simultaneously. Catherine and Margaret said they had no choice. They were already in too deep. And Josiah, who had his own reasons for accepting the risk, agreed. The arrangement began in October. It was methodical and ritualized to minimize danger. Catherine took Monday and Wednesday. Margaret took Thursday and Saturday. The other nights, Josiah slept alone or continued working on the forgeries and legal documents that were still arriving from Whitmore's camp. For 6 weeks, it held. The fraud continued successfully. Whitmore's pressure lessened. 2 other creditors agreed to payment extensions based on the fictional Savannah attorney's negotiations. The plantation, impossibly, began to stabilize. But the human cost was mounting. Catherine and Margaret, who had once been close, now barely spoke except about plantation business. The jealousy between them was a living thing, poisonous and consuming. Each resented the other's nights. Each questioned whether Josiah preferred her sister. The conspiracy that had brought them together was now tearing them apart. And Josiah, caught between them, was sinking under the weight of what he had become. He was still enslaved in every legal sense. He still worked the fields during the day under the overseer's watch. But at night, he lived in a different world, one where he held power over 2 white women who needed him desperately. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. He knew it could not last. He knew that every night was borrowed time. The crisis came in January 1836. Catherine discovered she was pregnant. She told no one at first. She waited, praying she was wrong, hoping her courses would simply resume. But by the end of the month, there was no doubt. She was carrying Josiah's child. South Carolina law on this matter was brutally clear. A child born to a white woman and a black man was legally considered black and would be enslaved. But the white woman would be charged with fornication and miscegenation, crimes that carried penalties ranging from public whipping to years of imprisonment. And the enslaved man would be executed without trial. Catherine understood that revealing her pregnancy was death for Josiah and ruin for herself. She considered trying to hide it, perhaps claiming illness and remaining out of public view. But she quickly realized the impossibility. Charleston society was small and vicious. Rumors would spread, questions would be asked, and Judge Whitmore, still suspicious, would hear everything. She had one option. She had to end the pregnancy. It was illegal, dangerous, and against every moral principle she had been taught. But there was no alternative. She told Margaret first, and Margaret's response shocked her. Margaret revealed that she was also pregnant. The sisters sat in Catherine's room in the dark and understood that they were looking at the end of everything. 2 pregnancies from the same enslaved man. If discovered, it would not just be execution for Josiah and imprisonment for them. It would be a scandal so explosive that it would reverberate through Charleston society for years. The Ashford name would become synonymous with depravity. They agreed they had to terminate both pregnancies. But how? Going to a doctor was impossible. The moment a physician understood the situation, they would be obligated to report it to authorities. Finding an unlicensed midwife was possible, but midwives talked, and the risk of exposure was enormous. It was Josiah who found the solution. He had read, in his secret library of borrowed and stolen books, about certain herbal preparations used by enslaved women to prevent or end pregnancies. It was dangerous knowledge. Information passed in whispers among those who understood that bringing a child into slavery might be its own form of cruelty. Josiah said he could attempt to create the preparation, but he warned them it was risky. The dosage was imprecise, and the consequences of error could range from ineffectiveness to serious harm. Catherine and Margaret had no choice. They agreed. Over the next week, Josiah gathered the necessary herbs from the plantation's woods and prepared the tincture exactly as he had read. He gave it to Catherine first. She drank it late one night, tasting the bitterness, and waited. The cramping began within hours. The bleeding started the next day. By the end of the week, the pregnancy was ended. Margaret took the preparation next. But something went wrong. The bleeding, when it started, did not stop. Within 2 days, Margaret was dangerously ill, feverish and pale. Catherine, terrified, wanted to call for a doctor, but Margaret refused. She knew that a doctor's examination would reveal what she had done. Better to die, she whispered, than to destroy them all. For 3 days, Margaret hovered at the edge of death while Catherine and Josiah watched helplessly. The fever finally broke on the 4th day. The bleeding slowed. Margaret survived, but barely. She was weak for weeks afterward, confined to her bed with what Catherine told visitors was a severe influenza. During Margaret's convalescence, something shifted in the household. Josiah, who had maintained a careful emotional distance despite the physical intimacy, began to speak about freedom in concrete terms. He told Catherine that he had been quietly forging papers, identity documents that could potentially allow him to pass as a free black man if he reached a northern state. He had been planning this for months, waiting for the right moment. Catherine realized with growing horror that Josiah intended to run, and she understood why. The pregnancy crisis had shown him, as nothing else could, that the arrangement was unsustainable. Eventually, the secret would come out, and when it did, he would die. She asked him not to go. She promised him that they would find a way, that they would manumit him legally somehow. But Josiah smiled sadly and asked how exactly she planned to free him when she did not even own him legally. The Ashford estate was still technically under the control of the creditors. Until the debts were fully resolved, no enslaved people could be freed without creditor approval. And seeking that approval would mean revealing Josiah's existence and skills to men like Whitmore. Catherine had no answer. In March, Whitmore made his final move. He announced he was running for the South Carolina state legislature and needed to settle all outstanding business affairs. He demanded a complete accounting of Ashford finances and insisted on a face-to-face meeting with the Savannah attorney who had been handling their negotiations. It was over. There was no attorney. There was no way to produce one. If Catherine attempted any further delay, Whitmore would move for immediate foreclosure. And this time, he would investigate thoroughly. He would discover the forgeries. He would discover Josiah. He would discover everything. Catherine and Margaret held a final midnight meeting with Josiah in early April. The three of them sat in his small room and confronted the truth. They had extended their survival by months through brilliance and crime, but time had run out. Whitmore would be at Ashford Plantation in 2 weeks. When he arrived, the fiction they had built would collapse. Josiah told them he was leaving that night. He had his forged papers. He had memorized routes north that followed the underground networks of abolitionists and free black communities. If he moved quickly and carefully, he might reach Pennsylvania within 6 weeks. Catherine begged him to wait, to let her try one final negotiation with Whitmore. But Josiah shook his head. He told her that his survival and theirs now required separation. As long as he remained, he was a loaded weapon pointed at all their heads. His absence would be a mystery, but not proof of anything. They could claim he had run off, as enslaved people sometimes did. They would face financial loss from his escape, but not criminal prosecution. Margaret asked if he had any feelings for them at all, or if they had simply been tools for his eventual freedom. Josiah was quiet for a long time. Then he said that he had loved them both in ways he never thought possible, but that love under the conditions of slavery was always corrupted. What they had shared was real, but could never be free. And without freedom, it would only destroy them. He left 2 hours before dawn. Catherine watched from her window as he disappeared into the tree line at the edge of the property. She never saw him again. When the overseer discovered Josiah missing at morning roll call, Catherine feigned shock and anger. She offered a $50 reward for his capture and return. She filed reports with the county slave patrol. She performed outrage perfectly. Whitmore arrived 2 weeks later as scheduled. He demanded to see the Savannah attorney's documents. Catherine told him the attorney had ceased communication and that she now suspected the man had been a fraud, taking advantage of their desperate situation. She admitted she had been duped and offered to settle Whitmore's note at 70 cents on the dollar, paid over 3 years. It was a humiliating admission of defeat, but Whitmore, sensing total victory, agreed. The technical error Josiah had discovered was never mentioned. The forgeries were never detected. The Ashford plantation survived, though greatly diminished. Catherine and Margaret never married. They lived together in the main house for the next 23 years, managing the property with grim efficiency. They rarely spoke of that year. The secret remained buried. But occasionally, late at night, Catherine would walk to the small room off the kitchen where Josiah had once lived. She would stand in the doorway and remember the weight of impossible choices. She would remember the man who had saved them and whom they could not save in return. And she would wonder if he had made it north. She hoped he had. She hoped he was free. In 1865, when Union troops occupied Charleston and emancipation became law, Catherine Ashford was 61 years old. She stood on the porch of the house she had fought so desperately to keep and watched as the formerly enslaved people of Ashford Plantation walked away as free men and women. She understood then that the system she had participated in, even as she had transgressed against it, had been monstrous beyond measure. The crime she and Josiah had committed together paled against the greater crime of the institution itself. She never learned what happened to Josiah. No letters arrived. No word came through the networks of freed people who traveled south after the war. He had disappeared into history as so many had, leaving behind only the memory of his brilliance and the impossible love that could never be spoken aloud. The Ashford sisters died within months of each other in 1868. Their estate, such as it was divided among distant cousins. The small room off the kitchen where Josiah had once read Blackstone by candlelight was torn down during renovations in 1871. The plantation itself was sold in 1889 and eventually subdivided into smaller farms. By 1920, no trace of the original main house remained. But the story survived, passed down in fragments through family letters and the whispered histories of those who had been enslaved there. And in those fragments, we find a truth that official histories have always been reluctant to confront. The antebellum South was not just a system of economic exploitation. It was a system of absolute power that twisted every human relationship it touched. Love under such conditions became transgression. Survival required crime. And freedom, when it came not through the nobility of the oppressors, but through the courage and brilliance of those who refused to accept their bondage as natural or permanent. Josiah's fate remains unknown. But we do know this. A man matching his description, calling himself Joseph Ash, appeared in Philadelphia in 1837 and established himself as a clerk in a shipping firm. He worked there for 12 years, earning a reputation for brilliance with legal documents and contracts. He married in 1840 and had 3 children. When the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made even northern cities dangerous for escaped enslaved people, Joseph Ashe moved his family to Canada. He lived in Toronto until his death in 1882, a free man for 46 years. We cannot prove conclusively that Joseph Ashe was Josiah. The documentation is incomplete, but the dates align, the skills match, and in letters preserved by his descendants, Joseph Ashe occasionally mentioned his time in South Carolina, though always obliquely, as though the memories were too dangerous to fully articulate even decades later. If Joseph Ashe was Josiah, then the story of the Ashford sisters has a final chapter. It means that one person, at least, escaped the trap that slavery set. It means that brilliance and courage, even under impossible circumstances, could sometimes forge a path to freedom. And it means that the love or need or desperate alliance that Catherine, Margaret, and Josiah shared, however broken and transgressive, ultimately served the cause of one person's liberation. That is a complicated legacy. It does not erase the suffering. It does not justify the system. But it reminds us that resistance took many forms, and that survival itself was sometimes an act of revolution. The truth of the antebellum South was always more shocking than the fiction. If this story of forbidden passion and ultimate survival moved you, please take a moment to subscribe. Your support helps us uncover more of the forbidden history that the textbooks left out. Click the bell to ensure you don't miss the next dark secret.